Hi, folks. Welcome to another episode of Film Study. This is Ken McKusick. We're here to continue our Recollections series, taking a break from expectations for a day here, and talk about the legendary career of Kyle Boller as a Raven. Joining me to do that is Alec Poulianos. Alec, how you doing?
Doing well, Ken. Excited to talk about Kyle Boller with you.
Excited is not the word I'd use. In a little bit of a nasty mood from the Oriole game. I'm sure that's going to come through. But I didn't feel too good about Boller when I was writing up my notes either. The memories are generally speaking not too darn good. But guy, you went to Cal, had a career there. It's a big flashing warning light, sometimes even a comical thing to be a Tedford quarterback at this point, and all of the things that went wrong with them and the ones that made it to the NFL.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting story. I was looking more into it. Born in California, was a heralded prospect, like one of the best that California had seen since John Elway during his high school years. Was a 3.5-year starter at California. The thing that kind of tickled me is that he was the second best Pac-10 QB in the draft. And Carson Wentz obviously went first overall to the Bengals, our divisional rival.
Carson Palmer.
Carson Palmer. And then Carson Palmer then they met up near the end of their careers together again as well. And I just thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah. So Tedford in his time at Cal and Oregon had 6 separate first-round picks at quarterback. Kyle Boller, David Carr, and he hung around it's a very bad circumstance originally with the Texans, but he hung around for a while. Trent Dilfer, obviously much maligned. Joey Harrington, much maligned. Aaron Rodgers, now the butt of many jokes, and Achilles Smith. So not a great group, but there is a Hall of Famer in there.
Yeah, I didn't know that history, so that's kind of an interesting twist. One of the other things I thought was kind of weird about going backwards in time, I wanted to say, what other QBs were drafted in this draft? And it reminded me that, of course, this is the same draft that the whole Byron Leftwich situation went down with the Vikings and the trade that didn't go through and the phone lines. Now there's 3 phone lines and all that good stuff. So, it's just it almost never would have happened, right?
We need to go through that story because the Ravens are drafting 10th overall. Kyle Boller had a legendary combine performance, not so much for the accuracy of his arm as much as he went out to the 50-yard line, kneeled down, and threw the ball through the uprights.
Right.
And that's what people remember him for. Now, a throw of 60 yards in the air is not really that special, certainly anymore. Doing it from your knees is certainly a lot more special, but still, it was a stunt. And then, of course, the drama in that first round, because a lot of people were saying, who are the Ravens going to draft? Everybody basically agreed that the Orioles or the Ravens needed to draft a quarterback, but they might have drafted one later. There probably wasn't going to be a whole lot available. But the Byron Leftwich was the big name that might have been available at number 10 overall. Well, what happened? The Minnesota Vikings had the 7th overall pick. They were trading it to the Ravens, and the Ravens reportedly would have drafted Leftwich with the pick. But there was some skullduggery involved. The Ravens didn't consummate the selection somehow. They blamed a bad phone line. I don't know who I believe here, but it doesn't really matter. The Vikings end up missing their chance to pick. 2 additional picks get made, the first being Leftwich, and the second one I think was Jordan Gross to Carolina, a good hell of a player. Goes at that number 8 spot. And then the Vikings drafted Williams, right? Is that right? Or do I have the name wrong? I thought that was the guy. We'll have to look that up.
It feels
right.
I'll
let you look it up as we go here.
Yeah.
And then that left the Ravens still at number 10 with the draft pick. And they got Terrell Suggs, who the claim always now is, which was much higher on their board. And no one's going to admit that Suggs was not higher on the board than Boller was. But he was. They did not think there was any chance that they get his Kevin Williams, a defensive tackle.
Yeah, it was Kevin Williams. Yep.
And he was a good player too. Played for a number 6 Pro Bowls, 5 All-Pro ones in 12 seasons. So he had a hell of a career. Leftwich did not. He might still be a good coach, but Terrell Suggs, of course, great pick at number 10, and the Ravens certainly did not rue that selection even after the drama and they certainly did not rue it after losing out on Leftwich to draft Suggs.
Yeah, I'm looking at my Terrell Suggs Ring of Honor pin right now, and I think I'm glad that we ended up with him. But the Ravens couldn't help themselves. They traded their future first-round pick, and who turned out to be Wilfork.
Yes.
Wilfork to the Patriots, moved into the 19th spot, and they selected Boller. So I'll say this, like, one of the reasons I brought him up, I have a couple like connections, so to speak, with Kyle Boller. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring him up is like, this was my first of a few, almost coming of age stories, reeling the shiny prospect might not turn out. And and I was just excited as a young fan to see us get a new quarterback. And like, of course, I saw him throw from the 50-yard line. I thought that was really cool, and just like kind of got caught up in the excitement of what he might be able to bring with that strong arm. And of course now, I was just a casual fan, I guess, at that point, young and everything. But it was just kind of interesting to think back on.
So I've asked Brian Billick about that when he was at a speaking event, and I asked him, take us through the drama of the 2003 first round. He talks about the Suggs pick, and very glowingly, and you'd almost think it was his idea, but there's no freaking doubt about it. Billick was the guy who was rattling the cage, trying to get the Ravens to trade back into the first round for Boller. He wanted to create a real offense in Baltimore. He was an offensive-minded coach, and that's what he wanted. And you can't blame it on Ozzie. I think it was a concession almost from Newsome. It wouldn't surprise me if Billick wanted to take Boller at number 10 or trade back and not take Suggs otherwise at that spot. But obviously that would have been an enormous mistake given what it turned out. But it is almost like it's an out-of-body experience for Billick, the way he's described it to me. So okay. It's just an interesting little tidbit how we kind of self-correct the past in terms of to fit our own narrative, I guess. But I fully believe that was Billick's guiding hand, making the Ravens, or pleading for Ozzie to move back into round one to draft Kyle Boller.
That feels right. And I never actually have read his book about QB selections. I've always been curious about it, and I know that he talks about the Boller selection in that one. But yeah, have you read that before, Ken?
I have not. No, I know there was one great book, and Ed, the artist known as Ed Romeo, has offered to lend it to me, and I was able to grab a PDF copy of it. The Walsh Billick book is outstanding. It's very hard to find in print, but there is a PDF out there floating around if you search on the internet for it, and you can read it. Some absolutely fabulous stuff in that book.
Very cool.
Anyway, Boller in 2003 in the preseason really extended his own hype by having a big preseason, winning the starting job. At that point, there were, I'm trying to even remember who else was in the writing. I know who ended up getting the quarterback job that year, but that wasn't. So I think it was basically Redmond was his competition in the 2003 early season. Redmond, eventually got a chance in the game. Boller was injured, played so poorly. It was his last game as a Raven. Never played again, and had a nice run as an insurance agent, and then came out of retirement to play for Atlanta a few years later. As I think might have been 5 years past before Redmond was back in the NFL, but it was a not insignificant portion of time. But anyway, the fact that Boller won the job during the preseason, even against not great competition, was pretty exciting for a young fan at that day, I bet. Yeah,
and I mean, the season wasn't horrid. It wasn't great. He went 5-3 before having the quad injury. Oh, okay, yeah, and then he, it wasn't the best stats though. More interceptions than touchdowns. Different era of football, obviously, than we are dealing with now. One thing that I kind of forgot about was that he was like sort of sneaky fast. Ran a 4.61 in the 40 in the combine, so like had decent mobility. And I remember watching when I was watching some of his highlights and lowlights, those exist too on the internet. I was like, he had a little bit more speed than I maybe even recalled. But yeah, I mean, it was a rookie season, right? Like I remember thinking to myself, okay, like we don't know what we have yet. There wasn't that much to hold on to, but there wasn't too much. It wasn't so horrible where you didn't think there was a possible for a turnaround.
I'd agree with that. And he certainly was still hopeful when they got him back in 2004 that he was going to immediately take over and lead the team and be the best quarterback there. But 5-4, he got the credit for the game in which he was injured for being the starting quarterback at St. Louis. He actually didn't finish that game. Redmond came in and was awful. And then the next week they gave the job to Anthony Wright. And he lost that horrid 6-3 game at Miami. It's one of two times that a party ended at our house because we were very frustrated about the result on TV. And this is one of those times anyway. Ed Reed set him up nicely with an interception to try and win the game, and they couldn't get it done. And then they ended up losing that game, I think 9-6 in overtime. So it was a 6-6 going into overtime. So you can tell it was not a lot of offense in that game. The defense, as that whole season, really led the team. But it then, from that point forward, became Anthony Wright's team. He won 5 out of 6 down the stretch, took the Ravens into the wild card game, the biggest win in that run. I mean, they had lots of big wins in that run. They beat San Francisco 44-6. They beat the Bengals 31-13 in a game where they really trounced the other competition for the division and did that in Baltimore. But the big one, they came back in Seattle and won 44-41 in a game they trailed by 17 with under 7 minutes to play. So outstanding run for Wright, who was twice the Ravens' backup quarterback, never the starter at the beginning of the year. And then when Boller came back and Boller was healthy to play in that playoff game, actually even before then, Billick announced this is Anthony Wright's team now. Yeah. And it was the right call for that moment in time.
For sure, yeah. Given the momentum that was kind of going that way, and just I mean. I think one of the things that's really cool too, I want to call it out before I forget, is that Jake Luke goes back and looks at kind of this part of the Ravens years, call it the season in between. It was kind of talking about the 2006 season in most, but like you have to talk about Boller in order to get there, and it's so interesting how close this team was. Like you mentioned, they made the playoffs. With that defense, but just weren't able to really get over the hump because of quarterback play. Yeah.
And the 2003 team, the playoff game was actually a microcosm of the season. They did nothing offensively. They stayed in the game because Steve McNair threw 3 interceptions, including one that was run back by Will Demps. Anthony Wright did finally throw a touchdown pass to get the game tied, but they couldn't get over the hump despite an enormous Chris McAllister interception that would have set up a game-winning field goal drive with about 2.5 minutes left to go. But Anthony Wright could not convert on that, unfortunately, and that ended the Ravens season. They come back. It's 2004. Yeah. The 2004 season is very forgettable in a lot of ways, but the Ravens were playing pretty darn good football. They left New York after the No That's Ed Reed game at 6-3, and then they lost 4 out of 5 to. They might have won one more game, and then they lost 4 out of 5 to drop out of even the wild card. And they did win the final game against Miami in January of 2005, but. Boller was horrible during that stretch. They lost 4 out of 5, 4 games under a 60 passer rating during that stretch. They had a horrible blown lead to Cincinnati when they're up 20-3 in the fourth quarter. It wouldn't have surprised me if that was the end of the Boller era right at that moment, but they had a lot invested in him at that point.
Right. Yeah, this year was not anything to call home about. Only the full season for Boller. But 55% completions, 13 touchdowns, 11 interceptions. The offense was still very anemic. Mm-hmm. The rushing wasn't anything too spectacular. It just, and the thing too about Boller, this was also like the Mike Flynn years, right? Where like, the step in on the feet, and also like I feel like it was like also partially on Boller. I've never seen someone be so like leaning back when backpedaling. Like I feel like he was like trying to fall out of his shoes. So I mean, it's just like kind of a mess of a season there.
He was kind of a squirrel running around with a nut with a football too. I mean, he never seemed to have a firm grasp. Well, a squirrel would probably have a firmer grasp on a nut, but honestly, he not infrequently would lose the ball without being touched. His knee would be hopping around and get him. It wasn't like Tony Banks, where it's basically any blindside hit was usually a fumble. It was more like his own special brand of weird in terms of losing the football on the run. something happened before that 2004 season, I thought, that kind of underscored what was going on there with Billick and Boller. Because I don't know if the relationship was falling out, but Billick probably was not happy with Boller's work ethic. And the thing that came up, they were both on a talk show of some sort. I don't remember if it was on ESPN or early version of the NFL Network, because I think this would have been before the NFL Network was actually born, but it was in 2004. And Boller was asked, first of all, about dating Tara Reid. Okay. And first of all, that's a whole brand of comedy right there. There's a lot of Tara Reid jokes you can make, or a lot of Kyle Boller jokes you can make with relation to their relationship. But at the end of the thing, with, basically the host has finished their last question, said goodbye to Kyle, asked the last question of Billick, and Billick says, "Hope you're ready to come back to work now, Kyle." Now, what the hell does that tell you about his season? And I may have the words slightly wrong, but I am not misjudging the intent of that at all. It basically was exactly that. It might have been, "Are you ready to come back to work now?" kind of thing.
Oh boy!
But it did not speak well of what he was spending his off season on.
Yeah. I mean, I will say this. Another reason I brought up Kyle is, as a young fan, me and my co-host now on One Money Pod, Peter, went to training camp, and Kyle just talked to us for a while, maybe like 5 minutes. Just very nice guy, and again, like increased like the love story, so to speak, right? Like the desire for him to succeed, right? He seemed like a good guy and all that good stuff. Had a nice personality, and it just took the time with fans, I thought. So let's talk about 2005, which I labeled as the year of false hope.
Okay, well, it's obviously a terrible year for the Ravens, and I'll just say defensively, they were decimated by injuries in the secondary. I frequently talk about how they had 265 snaps that year with 3 defensive backs on the field. Something is actually a very marvelously attributable to the combination of Scott and primarily Dallas Thomas, who could cover no problem when the other team put a 21 or 12 personnel package on the field. So that's nice. But that team really was getting by with very little in the secondary with a lot of injuries. But on the offensive side, nothing went right.
No. Boller gets turf toe against the Colts and misses 7 games. In that period, there were 4 games without a passing touchdown. So, the season's off to a very poor start. Just seeing LLL, all throughout. He comes back against the Bengals and has a horrible first half. 8 passer rating, 4 for 12, 1 interception. But then
they got down 29-0 or something, or 28-0, and then they made somewhat of a comeback.
Correct. Yeah. So they were down big, and then in the second half, he goes 14 for 20, 174 yards, 3 touchdowns and a pick. And there's a little bit of life in that comeback.
Yeah. He was letting it rip a bit in that game, is my recollection. And one of the things that Kyle Boller had an incredible difficulty doing was throwing any sort of touch pass. So if you had to throw it, had to have any sort of up and down throw. I mean, throw it over that linebacker and in front of that safety. I think he was very hesitant to make those throws, but he's also very unsuccessful at them when he did them. So most of his passes that are successful, he throws on a line. He needs a direct, line basically to the receiver. Didn't really have good touch on the deep ball either. And that, by the way, that's a very bad combination. Is not having up and down touch or touch on the deep ball. It meant that a lot of what he threw was to the outside to Derek Mason, who was a good comeback runner and could do some things for him. But he was extremely limited as a quarterback in terms of what he brought to the field in terms of ability to make certain throws.
Yeah, he was. I just remember, for all the hype of throwing such a long ball from the 50 on his knees, like he just didn't have the touch. Like, and you can see it in all of his highlights, even in college. Just the way the ball came out. I felt like it could have been a sign, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, the big thing though is, I remember this. Peter always makes fun of me for this. So against Green Bay and against the Vikings, he has 2 of the best games of his career, right? 48-3 victory in Week 14 against the Packers. through 19 for 27, 253 yards, 3 touchdowns, and no picks. And follows it up against the Vikings with 24 for 34, 289 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 1 interception. And just like he showed a little flash at the end of the season. And I thought maybe, just maybe, he might have figured it out at the last moment. But obviously the Ravens saw through it.
Every year, data breaches are on the rise. In 2022, the number of victims shot up nearly 41.5% from the previous year. And your personal information is at risk. With hundreds of commercial databases ready to be hacked, and that number of victims, it keeps going up each year. Plus, the U.S. has another big data privacy problem, the people search sites. You guys have all seen these. These are websites that create detailed personal profiles on millions of Americans and then publish them online for anyone to see. Your address, your phone number, even family details are just a click away. But there's a way to protect yourself. Meet Incogni. Incogni reaches out to data brokers on your behalf, requests the removal of your personal data, and handles any objections they may have. This means less stress for you and more peace of mind. With Incogni, you can safeguard your information from cyber criminals who steal social security numbers and other sensitive personal data to commit identity theft. Imagine the relief of knowing that your personal data is no longer easy prey for hackers. Incogni also protects you from data brokers selling your information to companies to target vulnerable and disadvantaged groups, exposing you to even more discrimination. These lists with titles like Tough Start, Young Single Parents, Rural, and Barely Making It can harm you both online and offline. Don't let your personal data fall into the wrong hands. Take control with Incogni today. Visit incogni.com/film study and safeguard your privacy now. It's time to reclaim your digital security. That's Incogni/film study. INCOGNI.com/film study. Incogni, your shield in a digital world.
And change plans for the 2006 seasons. Oh, you're on mute, Ken.
You mentioned his college stats there. I just want to backtrack to those for just a second and think about a quarterback who plays 44 college games, which he did in the Pac-10, and whether or not he would have any path to the NFL at this point. He had completed in his college career 47.8% of his passes. 3 of his 4 years, he was under 50%. His senior year, he's all the way up to 53.4. Right there. And this was well known at the time, by the way. This was one of the real big knocks on him at the time. In his first 3 years of college combined, he had 2 more interceptions than touchdowns, 38 to 36. Okay. 38 interceptions, 36 touchdowns. In his senior year, he had 28 and 10. So that was better. The 53% is still, would be a level that today would just not be accepted. There's an awful lot of guys who put up very gaudy numbers, even in places like the SEC, in terms of Devin Leary is 25 and 12 this last year. So obviously a lot better than Boller's career stats, and was much better than that at NC State before then. So, and he's a 6th-round pick. So, what are you going to do? But Boller rightfully took the backup role to McNair in 2006, and yet still had a highlight that season.
Yes, he did. But actually, you mentioned his college stats, Ken. Do you recall what the market was for Boller? Was it did people think he would go 1st round, 2nd round, or what did we reach? What was the feeling at that time?
I think the feeling was we definitely reached, but that he probably wasn't going to last till number 40 or wherever they were picking again. Let me see where the Ravens were actually. They traded their 2nd-round picks. I don't know that we're going to be able to find this out from me just looking at this, but
I do know Grossman went after him, so there was at least an appetite for another quarterback.
That's a pretty bad choice too.
Right. So maybe that would have been Kyle instead, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess we can talk about 2006. So they bring in McNair, but McNair's elder, and he had some injuries, and we'll talk about 2007 too, but he gets hurt, right? And I feel like Boller played decent in the times that he was called upon in 2006. And in many ways, kind of kept the season going in the right direction. And so in the Week 6 game, he was unable to have them make the comeback from the 9-point deficit, but he did score. Huh? Yeah,
against the Panthers.
Yep. Threw a 62-yard touchdown to Clayton.
I'll just say that was a deflected pass collected by Clayton out of the air. It's a very rare touch by an offensive player and then to another offensive player, but it was a rare thing. And Clayton had 2 catches that year of that type, but not a touch throw.
Not a touch throw.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then defense gave him another touchdown. They drove down the field again, scored a 7-yard touchdown to Heap, but inevitably lost 23-21 because they were unable to get the ball back.
But he did have the division clinching win against the Browns. Yes. And in fact, he had his quarterback rating for the only time in his career was over 100. In fact, for many years, he was the only Ravens quarterback ever to have a 100 quarterback rating. In the minimum number of throws is very low. There might have been someone who did it in like a Cook or somebody who did it in one or two throws, but there wasn't any quarterback who'd done it in like 25 throws or more. And he was the only guy who had, and until Lamar, I believe Lamar in 2019.
That's bonkers.
Was the first one. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So he comes in and he's able to score 2 touchdowns, 77-yard one to Demetrius Williams. And like you said, that clinched the playoff berth for the Ravens, who had all but locked up the division at that point.
Then they went back to McNair in the playoffs, and that didn't work out so great.
It wouldn't have worked out with Boller. That was still just the worst, though. I have vivid memories of watching that game. Mm-hmm. So what they do in 2007, McNair gets hurt again.
Yeah. Yep. And got hurt the very first week in that really awful loss to the Bengals. Now, we didn't really know that the Bengals were going to end up being okay. And I think that's what the Bengals were good in 2006, I believe. And although they finished only 8-8. And I believe they were actually not that good in 2007, as it turned out. But I'd have to look at that because my recollection is the Browns and Steelers were kind of fighting for the division title, and the Browns. I don't think the Browns even made the playoffs, but they lost the division title was the key thing. And the Ravens were nowhere near because they had another horrible year of secondary injuries. But in that very first game where Boller came in for McNair, he threw an interception in the end zone on 4th down to. Shut off any chance of a comeback at that point.
Right. So he's named interim starter for week 2. Has an okay showing. 2 touchdowns, 185 yards, no interceptions. That's always the key. To throw an interception, no. That helped his chances, right? But then week 3, McNair comes back. But Boller comes in relief. Kurt Warner kind of has this little bit of a comeback, but Boller was able to position the team for a game-winning field goal and escape it.
That was against the Cardinals, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I remember that one. The Cardinals, a great comeback by Warner, and the Ravens ended up winning in overtime. They won in the end of regulation. Trying to remember.
Looks like it was regulation.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well.
But yeah, then we got what happened next. Came back in week 6 and 7. Then after the bye, McNair was turned to. 2 bad divisional losses, and then Boller was named the star of the rest of the year, which is just a horrible turn of events for the whole organization.
He had a 75.2 passer rating. The good news is that kind of closed the Kyle Boller chapter with the Baltimore Ravens. And of course, the next year they drafted Joe Flacco and never really looked back for a decade from that pick. So a solid thing. Whatever you think of Joe Flacco, by the way, just remember what the other choices have been like. Sure, Lamar's been one of the greatest we've ever seen play the game, but the Ravens couldn't find a quarterback for the longest time, and Flacco was a pretty damn successful playoff quarterback at the very minimum. And there are still people who still think who are still Flacco apologists, basically at this point, who think he's better than Lamar. They're full of crap, or they've got other issues that I don't want to try and delve into, but they're sure of that. But just remember that whenever you're banging on Lamar about the lack of playoff success, very small sample size. Flacco, larger sample size, did exceptionally well, and a lot of it was on the road, which was good. Right. But he also benefited from having a fantastic defense, and he and that defense, in a lot of ways, grew up together. Ray had been there for years, and Ed had been there for years, but other components of it were assembled, and Flacco fit very well with that defense.
Yeah, and the thing that's kind of crazy is, so at the end of 2007, they fire Billick. This is though when Harbaugh comes in. Flacco's drafted, like you just mentioned, in a similar setup in a way, I feel like, as Boller, coming back, trading around and got Joe Flacco. And then I forgot about this, but Boller was still on the team, and he fought and started the first preseason game against the Patriots. But then he gets hurt and he's put on IR. So I do recall that. I believe like Joe Flacco was like basically the only healthy quarterback going into that game.
Well, let's see, there are a couple things that happened. So first of all, we didn't talk about Geno Smith at all, but Geno Smith actually won the job towards the end of 2007 and started a couple games, including a game at Seattle and maybe one other.
Troy Smith?
Troy Smith is who I mean. I'm sorry, not Geno Smith. You're right.
I made that mistake before too.
and Troy, after I believe the 2008 season, so he stayed on the Ravens through 2008, if I recall correctly, said he would crawl to Cleveland in the snow to play for the Browns. Which is, first of all, is not appropriate because it's tampering. Okay. and you just really shouldn't do that, but whatever. It didn't matter. I mean, it was also kind of just comical in those terms. And he may have been a free agent at the time. I honestly don't recall, but not a great quarterback, not the answer for the Ravens. And very fortunately, they decided pretty quickly in that 2007 season that he wasn't the guy. And the 2008 preseason, Flacco had, let's see, the recollection I have is Flacco had a really good third preseason game, but Smith had an illness. Boller might have been hurt, but I don't think there was ever a serious consideration that he was going to be the starter. But Smith had an illness and couldn't start the opener. They started Flacco in the opener, and in fact, they announced it. And then after the second week, when they they beat the Bengals pretty handily, but game that probably should have been about 31-7 or something, but it ended up being 17-10, I think.
Yeah.
They it might have been 31-3, might have been a reasonable outcome for that game. They destroyed the Bengals, and Flacco was great in the game. He ran for a touchdown. I think it might have been the longest run of his career in that game. And he also did he pass for a touchdown? Did he not? I'm trying to remember. Might not have passed for a touchdown, or he might have. But either way, he was really successful as rookie game. Played one more game. They won 28-6, largely keyed by the defense against Oakland. And at that point, Billick announced that Flacco was the quarterback for the Baltimore Ravens, and that was the end of any notion of Boller or Smith. Smith obviously felt like he never got his chance, and Boller, I don't think it had any currency with which to complain at that point.
This is so crazy. I forgot about this. In 2008, they had a week 2 bye week, which just seems criminal.
No, it wasn't scheduled that way. So what happened was there was a hurricane that hit Houston, and it brought down the roof of the Reliant Dome. And so they had to rearrange games and move that Houston week 2 game out to week 10. And then they moved other games around to.
I remember this now that you mention it. Yeah, I was like to say, like, that doesn't seem right. I mean, I remember they did some weird bye things in the past, but that didn't seem okay. Yeah.
It was one of the things that's really special about that 2008 team is getting by with that miserable second week bye game. I think it wasn't Katrina, right? Because I think Katrina was 2005, so it was some hurricane that hit Houston, some weather event that did that. I don't think it was a tornado. My recollection is it was a hurricane that did the damage.
But I do remember that now that you mentioned it, that there was other things that happened that year.
Yeah. So, any big moments to remember from Kyle Boller, the quarterback?
I mean, just like I said, I had a chat with him at the training camp. I remember I had a lot of really great conversations about the Ravens with my grandfather at that time. He was really happy that we got Flacco. I always hated Boller. He always muttered about him. And just like I said, that false hope again in my naivety as a kid, just hoping that he would turn it around and have figured it out, but just lacked the touch. But it seems like he's lived a decent life after the game with his family, and he's a happy guy. Just trying to stay away from the limelight because obviously he didn't have the best career when he was under the lights.
Good for him. Good for him. I've got two specific highlights to mention. The first was his second career start. Was Jamal Lewis's 295-yard game. against the Browns. Yeah. So it takes a real confluence of circumstance to get a 295-yard game. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, because not only does the running back need to break some long runs, and he had 3 separate long broken runs, but you got to have a quarterback in a lot of ways that you don't want to touch the football. And Boller was something like 7 of 17 for some ridiculous amount of yards, like, I don't know, 60 yards or something on that day. It wasn't much. It was under 100. And, he basically, Jamal Lewis was the entire offense. The offensive line was happy to be doing that way. And the defense had a huge game where they basically took the Browns off the field continuously and gave the ball back to Jamal, because when you're running the football as much as the Ravens did that day, you run the clock out too. So it's very hard to have opportunities to go for that many yards. And obviously, I think one of the legitimate criticisms about Billick in 2003 is that he played a little bit of record ball once during this game to try and get Jamal the record, which was at the time was only 278. It's since been passed with a 296-yard game from Adrian Peterson. But that he also, in the final game of the season, with only 6 days, because they're playing on Monday night, I believe. Maybe they're playing Sunday night, but it was one of the others. A night game followed the week after by a wild card game. A wild card game to be played in Baltimore. He had Jamal still out there in overtime running the football against the Steelers.
Yeah, I remember that too. They're trying to get that record. But the thing I'm looking at now, so he's got 78 yards, Kyle Boller did. 25 of them on one play. So, just unbelievably poor. I'm at 7 for 17, like you said, and 3 sacks. So, and not it. That's in many ways that was the Kyle Boller experience. Like that box score right there really summarizes it.
Yeah. He had one other highlight I have is he had a real solid game in the win versus Tom Brady in the near upset in 2007. So Patriots came in here, and I forget if they were 15-0, 16-0, but they weren't 16-0 because that were only 16 games in the season back then. But they might have been 13 or 14-0. It was in December, right. And they came in, looking to stay perfect, and the Ravens, who were terrible, gave them one hell of a football game, weather aided. But Boller, I thought, proved himself to be reasonably wind resistant in that game, as is something I've often said about Flacco over the years, is he played very well in bad weather.
Right. Yeah. There's actually even a clip on YouTube about this that I watched in preparation for the show, kind of showing how Kyle was 2 yards away from being able to defeat the, at that time, undefeated Patriots.
2 yards, meaning where are those 2 yards? Are when the Patriots have the ball and they threw a penalty against who was the guy? Jermaine Winborn.
Wow.
Yeah. That's a name we've forgotten.
Your memory never ceases to amaze me.
This is one of those moments they get etched in. So anyway, it had kind of a bobble, I thought, as Gaffney or somebody like that was scoring the winning touchdown in that game. Jabbar Gaffney, does that sound right? Might have been him. Might have been somebody else too.
Maybe.
But anyway,
I don't know.
Good performance. Kept him in that game. Willis McGahee had a big game too that day, and they had a chance to win. And there was a timeout called from the sideline on 4th down as well that frustrated a lot of players on the defense. It was just one of those things. But anyway, if you're wondering, Tara Reid, who dated Boller prior to the 2004 season, appears to have dumped him for Sergei Fedorov, who was 14 years her senior. I don't know how many years older than Kyle that Tara Reid was, but there's some difference there as well. So,
boy.
Yeah.
Well, Kyle's married to Miss California.
Oh, really?
So,
okay.
Yeah.
So it worked out for him. She's probably a much sweeter girl than Tara Reid.
Yeah, they got together in 2010 and then had their first child in 2011. So,
okay.
Yeah. So just living their life in California now.
All right. Always fun to reminisce, even when we're being a little bit libelous is not exactly the correct word, but we don't have a lot of nice things to say about Kyle Boller because he's a fair comment individual that we're gonna talk our specific memories about, and unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of really nice memories there. No.
Yeah. It was important though for the Ravens. I feel like these years were important to talk about, like not just a brush under the rug. They did happen, and there was that 2006 season just snuck in the middle there. So there's a little glimmer, but unfortunately that was one of the worst playoff losses in memory. But only to be replaced by 19 and 23.
And a lot of people with 11 also, but
that's true. Yeah.
There's a horrible set of choices there, unfortunately, Ravens history. That's one thing, by the way. It's nothing to shy away from. If you have a great franchise that's consistently making the playoffs, you're going to exit the playoffs all years that you don't win the Super Bowl. And obviously, every one of those losses is going to sting like a motherfucker, and
I try to remind people of that. 31 teams feel bad.
Yeah. They never lost the Super Bowl. That's good. They
that's
did
going
lose
to be a tough one.
Yeah.
I hope I never get to see that day.
I hope I do get to see that day. I hope we see the Ravens play 5 Super Bowls, lose 1, and then we'll feel perfectly fine about it.
All right. If that's a trade, okay, I'll do it too.
All right. Well, fair enough. Alec, always fun to do this with you. Tell folks where they can talk football with you online.
Sure can. You can find us at One Winning Pod on Twitter, and of course our show. Did a State of the Division show just the other day. Just kind of went through and talked about all the free agency moves and draft acquisitions made by teams, any coaching changes and all that good stuff. Get us an idea of what we're facing come next year, and got me fired up for the season, I will say. But we're in a little bit of a dead time now and gear up for the preseason coming ahead.
All right. Looking forward to it. Other folks out there, if you'd like to be on a film study short, you hit me up. DMs are always open on Twitter. If you want a recollection series like this one on Kyle Boller, but hopefully about a player you have some nice things to say about, just drop me a DM with that player's name, and I'll get back to you, and we'll schedule. If you have a concern about the 2024 Ravens, some specific concern, really has to be something we can discuss in 15 to 30 minutes, then please send that to me, and we'll see if we can make that into part of the concerns series entering training camp. Again, those will be happening by early and mid-July, so there is a fuse on that thing, so please try and get back to me. Alec, thanks again for coming on.
Thank you, Ken.
I will talk to you next time on Film Study.